Hey everyone, so today we're going to kind of go over an introduction to World War II. World War II is a massive scale of events. Obviously, it's a world war, but one thing that I would like to kind of address very quickly. It's not going to be a full-on lesson today. Today is just kind of going to be explaining some things. One, we're going to digest what we talked about in World War I. So in World War I, I went over the Russian Revolution by itself, and then I went over the Russian Revolution as in a backdrop to World War I and the reasons behind that, right? So the reasons why Russia was angry, a lot of reasons as to why they revolted, was because they felt like Tsar Nicholas did not make a lot of smart decisions during World War I, and Russia was on the brink of a total collapse, and that's why they had to pull out and actually quit the war. The war officially ended in 1919, and then at about 1922, 1923, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. So we see a 4-year gap or something like that. It's not a lot of years, and we already see why this happened, like the anger, the bitterness as to why he actually had that, and a lot of people are kind of confused as to why he chose the Jews. It's because they were not the ones fighting, therefore they're not the ones that were impoverished. Their businesses were afloat. They were still able to afford things, while the Germans themselves, they were not. The treaty said that they blamed, that Germany was expected to take all blame and be forced to pay for all the reparations and everything. So if you remember correctly though, the country that actually struck first and made an actual attack was Serbia. And Serbia was not part of any of these treaties. I mean, think about it. We didn't talk about Serbia again, except in the beginning with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then Russia wasn't even allowed to attend the treaty and the League of Nations. They weren't allowed to do any of that. So the reason why Germany was blamed for everything, though, is because once Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and then Russia, because they're allies of Serbia, they realized that they're gonna go to war, you know. Germany then was kind of backing up Austria-Hungary, and then declared war on both Russia and then France. So Germany, while it was not the first person to declare war on anybody, their military at the time was one of the most efficient, and we're going to talk about it, how in World War II, actually, their efficiency in World War II and why they were such a threat. They took the entire capital of France, they took Paris in 3 days. The French expected them to take about 3 weeks, and they were planning for 3 weeks and how to defend themselves for 3 weeks out. And then Germany rolled up and took everything in 3 days. And a big part of that, actually, was due to meth. Yay! I talked about heroin in World War I, so only fitting to talk about drugs again in World War II. But meth, it was an upper. It was to give energy, and it made them kind of superhuman in a way. So when we think about things like Captain America and the whole super soldier serum thing, well, we didn't come up with a super serum, we just gave them meth. Not we, but the Germans, they just gave out meth. And they didn't feel pain, right? So if they were injured, they could still keep going. They were aggressive, and they did not stop, right? That's the whole point. That's how you react and feel while you're on meth. And do not try this at all, please. So actually, it made a huge difference. And a lot of people don't really talk about that, but it's true. And I do want to say the one thing, though, before we get into a whole lot of the nitty-gritty details of World War II, I do not want you to come out of this hating an entire nation or an entire country I do not want you to hate all of Germany and Germans and think that every single German's a Nazi. Like, I don't want that to happen, because it's how a lot of lessons portray it, and it's kind of how they leave it. They really don't talk about the fact that there were Germans that were opposed to what Nazis and Hitler what they were doing. They don't talk about the fact that there were resistances forming within Germany itself, because that was the first place it started. And one thing I do also want to address as well is that the initial plans for this, we actually discovered, like archaeologists and historians discovered this, the initial plan for the Jews was actually not the whole mass murder. It was to kind of get them out of Germany and just kind of slowly push them out of the mainland. Goodness, the mainland of Europe. And the plan was called the Madagascar Plan. They were going to do kind of what England did with Australia, and how they sent all their prisoners to Australia, and then Australia became its own nation. But they were going to send them to Madagascar. But then at the Wannsee Conference in 1941, they realized that all of these Jews were still there, and then the labor camps. They did have the labor camps before 1941, and they did send Jews there. They were deporting Jews. They were deporting homosexuals. They were deporting people labeled as gypsies. They were called Roma because they were roaming, and also the region of which they were from. They were deporting some criminals, people that had mental illnesses, like disabilities. They deported like everybody that was not of the Aryan race, and they also didn't choose to keep people that posed threats. So sometimes the POWs, they were just sent off. This is a really dark subject, but anyway, they did have that. It just, the mass murdering wasn't to scale yet in the camps. Places like Auschwitz, places like Dachau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. I mean, there's actually a lot of them, but the most famous that you guys probably know about is Auschwitz. And you have stories coming out of this time frame, like Anne Frank and her family. And I think that the whole purpose of my lesson with you is to kind of, I mean, Anne Frank and her story is amazing, and it's sad. Her dad, I think, was the only one that survived, and then he found her diaries, and then he published it, and actually it sold, and it spread very fast in Europe, and it didn't actually come to the United States for a little while, but because it was so recent. Actually, it happened like right after the war was over. I mean, that's when it was all published and spread around Europe. I mean, it was crazy. You would think that they would try to suppress it, but they didn't. And there's excerpts that I'm going to actually like post onto Canvas for you to read that I've read personally, and these are primary source documents. These are like interviews and diaries and memoirs written by people that were in the camps, like people that survived it. And you'll very quickly learn that every single survivor story is a miracle. The fact that they went through it, the efficiency that the Germans had, the efficiency of any of the Axis powers it was astounding. And it was amazing that because I told you in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, it told the Germans, like, you cannot have any more than 100,000 people in your army. You cannot have more than 6 warships. You are not allowed to have submarines. And then they also couldn't make any weapons. They couldn't make any kind of military equipment. So when you think about it, you're like, well, then how the heck did they take over again, like, the world? How did they do that? Well, when Hitler was chancellor, he formed a lot of different deals with a lot of different people. And you'll see that the treaty was not upheld very well. I mean, we didn't even sign it. So, mainly because we didn't want to get dragged into another war, and we didn't want to. I think that when Pearl Harbor happened, there's conspiracies, there's theories that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, he knew and he allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. I'm not going to say whether I agree with that or not. I don't. I don't know. That's something that it will never, ever probably be confirmed because at the time he was a pretty well-liked president. I don't think. But I do think that judging by all of the letters and all of the different files that we have found from different, military personnel that were reporting suspicious things, and it's like the government kind of chose to not react in a way. They brushed it off. It's very strange that they would do that because you're like, the government can't be, these people can't be that stupid. Obviously something is suspicious, but then they were just brushed off. And then Japan decimated our aircrafts, and because we had all of our aircrafts at the time, not all of them ever in existence, but a big amount of them, the entire armory of Pearl Harbor, the entire unit there, the base, sorry, it took me a while to get there, all the aircrafts in Pearl Harbor were all put on the same tarmac. So all Japan had to do when they flew over, all they had to do was just look for that tarmac, and there were all these planes. And there's lots of footage that has been restored and actually put into color now, and from World War II, and there is a lot of footage from Pearl Harbor. And I would like to encourage you to go onto, if you have Netflix, go and find the series World War II in color, and it's the events that changed the war, and it's big stuff. There's an episode all about Pearl Harbor, there's D-Day. There's actually not a lot of footage of D-Day. You'd be surprised, live footage. There's some, and then Midway is another one. The Battle of Midway, that was a pretty big one. The story about how we even figured out that Japan was actually going to attack us was actually pretty interesting. And once I actually get to these battles and build up to us really joining the war and going overseas to help everyone in Europe, because we started kind of pushing in the Pacific, and then we took Japan's military away from them. We were like, no, you can't have a military again because we can't trust you. And then we did the internment camps. We made mistakes too, out of fear, out of bigotry, out of racism. It wasn't, these decisions they were, with hindsight, they were not good decisions. But it was because that they found out that there were people labeled Japanese civilians. They actually were spies. Japan had been thinking and brewing on their decisions at Pearl Harbor for months, years. And so we found out that there were actually people that were from Japan living in Hawaii as citizens, civilians, and they were spying the whole time for 9 months. So once that was found out, the government was like, oh my god, if that happened, then how many more could there be? And then the whole internment thing happened. So again, we'll talk about all of that in depth later. I just kind of wanted to give you a big intro to it because there's so much that happened during these years that is lumped into World War II. I will be doing a whole separate video for the Holocaust because I think that, like I said in the beginning, too often we kind of lump the two together and we don't give enough attention to one and then the other. I think that World War II and the fighting of World War II needs to be its own segment because military history-wise, that is one of the most fascinating wars. It sucks. It's horrible. Do not want to repeat it. But the stuff that people were doing to try and win the war was insane. The technology, the amount of inventing that was going on, the amount of testing, new ideas, it's insane. And you need to know these generals, you need to know who they are because of decisions that they made, lives were saved. Lots of lives. So I think it's important that you have that kind of emphasis, and then with the Holocaust itself, you need to know, you need to have more stories than just the big 6 million Jews. You need to have the bigger story as to like the process. And it's a really sad and disturbing fact of history and part of history, but you should know it. It's gruesome and it sucks, but more often than not, history is not pleasant. And again, one of my favorite quotes for this stuff is that just people that try to make peace their prerogative more often than not will create engines of war and destruction, and then before you know it, it's unleashed. And then people die. All with the idea of trying to protect people, people end up dead. And bitterness and anger. And you can kind of see from World War I all of the after effects of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and all the offenses that were made. Like, you can kind of see why people were angry. And we angered Japan. We didn't allow Japan pretty much after they helped us in World War I. They wanted to be able to immigrate to our country in Canada, and we were like, no, you're not. We don't want that. And they were stunned. They were like, why not? We helped you, and but because, of stupidity, in my opinion, it was a horrible decision. We didn't allow them to come here freely. It was a hard time for them to even get here. We didn't allow a lot of people to come here. We didn't allow a lot of immigration. And so I think, and that was proven to be a huge reason why they were angry. And then they went from their emperor ruling them to kind of a very militaristic, they had a dictatorship. Their leader was a general, right? He was in charge, and he brought in all these different admirals and generals, and then they made these very efficient machines, like war machines, and then they just annihilated our navy at Pearl Harbor. And a very interesting fact is that once Churchill, who was in charge of all the decision making on the Allied sides in Europe at the time before we ever showed up, when he found out that Pearl Harbor was attacked, and that people were obviously angry, right? We were like, okay, now we're ready to join the war, that kind of thing, because of how much he was losing and how much the attacks that Britain was suffering at the time was just horrific, and he really felt like they weren't going to win. But then when he heard about the news of Pearl Harbor, it was said, like, they found in his diaries that he said to himself, or he thought to himself that day, oh wow, we actually will win this, because of how much confidence that they had in the American military at the time. And I'm not trying to say like we're the best, better than all the rest, but our military has been, and hopefully will be. I'm part of it, right? It'd be bad. It has been very strong. And World War I, again, the Allied forces, mostly made up of British soldiers and anyone that Britain owned at the time, they looked to us to make a lot of decisions. And they realized that they had to get along with us. Their prejudices had to go out the door in order for us to win the war. And that's what we did. Again, it happened in World War II. So I look forward to telling you all these little mini pieces that are so interesting and super fascinating that really made it I can't believe that this stuff isn't focused on. But I guess the one cool thing about the online learning is that I'm not limited to a bell schedule. Yay! So I can kind of just chunk it up the way I want it to, and I don't have to just move through. I can actually just take a segment and just, there it is. So anyway, I hope this helps. I hope you look forward to going more in depth with World War II with me. And again, if I haven't told you already, I do miss you guys very much, and I'm sad that we won't be together again. At this point, it says May 1st, but I don't really think we're going to come back. It's not realistic. You'd only have 20-something days if you did. Seniors even less. So I don't know. I don't want you to have false hope. I don't want you to feel really let down. I want you to think realistically, still positively. We can still interact with each other. Just, there's, thankfully for you sophomores, there's next year, right? There's next year, and I asked to teach American history, so there's definitely hope that you can have me as a teacher again. So we have to stay positive, and if you need anything, feel free to reach out to me at any point. Comment down below, subscribe to my channel, right, and all that stuff. So reach out to me on Remind, email me, whatever you need. I'll see you soon.